Welcome back. Episode 5. Okay, the other day, last episode before last, something like that, we talked a little bit about the ovens, and I had brought up the question that if they were running these ovens flat out, so I think the number of ovens in Auschwitz originally was 15 ovens. So that's not super relevant to this episode. We'll make sure we're accurate with that when it is relevant, when it's time. But we talked about how a body needs some kind of accelerant, a combustible, a fuel to expel the moisture from the body before the body will actually begin to cremate and burn. And I honestly didn't know what they use, and so I researched it, and I made the point that if it was oil or gas, but more likely oil, they would have to have a lot of it. They would certainly have to have a lot of it to run these incinerators, these crematory around the clock, because they would have to run these things around the clock to even come close to the number of bodies that they claim to cremate, which even then, according to what I've read thus far, they still wouldn't be able to. It would just not even be close to possible to cremate as many bodies as what they said they could do. Which, could be an argument as to why finally it couldn't be, they couldn't resist. You see that bug? Sorry. Revising the number from 4 million to just over 4 million to just over 1 million people in Auschwitz. The gas chamber and oven story wasn't calculated. Just an idea. But now, if they had, ovens that were running on oil, they would have to have giant storages of oil outside of these crematories, wouldn't they? If they were running them out around the clock. Well, they were not oil, they were coal, which really proves the point even more. So I did a little bit of research, and evidently it would have taken, if they could have cremated 100 bodies a day in Birkenau. Now, Birkenau was a camp of Auschwitz. Each body would have taken 0.1 tons of coal. So if the calculation is right, I've not double-checked the calculation, but furthermore, it was said that it would take 150 tons of coal per day to cremate the amount of bodies they claim they could cremate in a day. And evidently, in Birkenau anyway, and we're talking about Birkenau specifically, and that's kind of, Birkenau was the host of many accusations when it came to this. So they would have had to have had some kind of coal storage outside, you would imagine, very close to the crematory or the crematorium. And we talked about, Allied forces had all kinds of aerial photos of Auschwitz. And there's another reason for that too, we'll touch on here soon. But it seems like from these aerial photos, you would be able to examine and see if they had storage for whatever accelerant. We found out that's coal. Well, somebody has done this. I apologize, I don't have his name right now, but it was somebody I watched, Ernst Zundel, the revisionist interview. And this person was an expert on aerial photo analysis in this specific case of Auschwitz and Birkenau. And there were no giant coal storages. Now, a very small coal storage, because they would have needed coal to run these furnaces for, you know, the people that died of natural causes, the people that died of disease, and for the people that did die at the hands of the SS. I personally believe that some of that did happen. This is really more about, was there a final solution to exterminate the Jews, and were they gassing and cremating these bodies? And so, as you can imagine, if they needed 150 tons of coal a day, they would have had to have not only had giant storages for this coal, but they would have had an absolute constant delivery of coal to this plant. And remember, Auschwitz was an IG Farben synthetic rubber, medication, and munitions plant. They produced synthetic rubber. They might have even produced synthetic fuel, synthetic gasoline too. I'm not sure about that. Now, from what I understand, one of the ingredients for these products, specifically for the synthetic rubber, was coal. And so part of the reason why Auschwitz was chosen to build this plant. Now let me back up real quick. Auschwitz was originally a Polish military barracks after Germany went to war with Poland and had more or less defeated Poland, at least this portion of Poland. They turned it into first a prison camp for Polish soldiers, and then later a production plant for rubber, munitions, medicine, owned and operated by IG Farben. They didn't own the camp, but the company that did this was IG Farben. And they did need a lot of coal. So with the argument that, you know, they could have obtained that amount of coal, I suppose they could have done that. But this was also a country that, like the Allied forces as well, they needed these resources for war. So that could be used as an argument that why would they use 150 tons of coal per day to cremate bodies when they needed that resource for their war machine. So I just wanted to add too that synthetic rubber and synthetic fuel was not just vital to Germany, but to British, to the Soviet Union, to the United States. And IG Farben at Auschwitz was more technologically advanced in this process than the rest of the world. And that's partly why the United States, specifically in this case, and Britain, had such an interest in Auschwitz, because they were trying to learn everything they could from Auschwitz and IG Farben in this process. And that is partly why they had so much aerial surveillance and aerial photos, so many aerial photos of Auschwitz. So a couple other things that this guy, that Ernst interviewed in regards to aerial photos, pointed out was that Auschwitz was surrounded by farmland, and according to these aerial photos that the United States and Allied forces had taken, that land was farmed clear up until the end of the war. And that the fence around Auschwitz was see-through. It was not a solid wall. And so anybody outside on, working the farm, or anybody, a spy, reconnaissance, anybody that was outside of Auschwitz could see into Auschwitz and see what was going on. And it seems like if Auschwitz was going to be designed and constructed originally to be a death camp, and that its sole purpose was to be a death camp, that they maybe wouldn't have allowed people from outside to see into Auschwitz and what they were doing. Because it was an allegation by, Allied forces, certain members in the United States government that started these, some say propaganda about a final solution to exterminate the Jews. The World Jewish Congress has allegations that they were responsible for starting this propaganda. World Zionists, Theodore Herzl, people like this their accusations, it is alleged that they started the propaganda that there was a final solution to exterminate Jews. In this theory, I'm not going to say that's entirely what I believe at this point, but so did another thing, the condition that people use the argument that what about when the Allied forces showed up and they found inmates, most of whom were Jews, that were skin and bones, that they were intentionally being starved. Well, you have to remember that the Allied forces had relentlessly and effectively bombed Germany's supply lines, the railroads, even road transport by road. They had intentionally destroyed these supply lines, and so there were Germans that were losing weight. German soldiers were having a hard time eating, and so naturally, as people that were already in harsh conditions were starving and malnourished, your immune system is weakened. With the typhus epidemic that was sweeping through not just Auschwitz and Birkenau, Belsen, but really it was a problem throughout Germany, and some say not even just Germany, but throughout Europe. These were problems, and so when the Allied forces showed up and they saw dead bodies laying around, it was allegedly it was the result of the breaking down of the conditions and the preventative process to keep typhus out of the camps, and they couldn't keep up with it anymore. And in fact, Belsen or Birkenau was considered to be a sick camp. At that point, they were sending their sick there, people that already had typhus and other diseases as the result of poor conditions, malnutrition, and so people were at that point, they just couldn't keep up with it anymore, and people were dying rapidly. So, the United States interned Japanese Americans and these Japanese Americans, like prisoners of war, political political prisoners, Jews, homosexuals, criminals, Jehovah's Witness, all these people were put in these internment camps, and their homes were taken, their belongings, their money. The United States did the same thing. Now, you would make the argument, Japanese Americans in internment camps weren't dying and living in the same kind of conditions, that it's not really the same thing. And I would agree with you. But would we be able to say that had the United States fought a war on their soil? If the United States had supply lines bombed and destroyed, it's speculation, but I think that that's something that should be looked at. So we're gonna kind of shift gears a little bit, move on. I'd also want to say that I'm going to revise my title here. I'm not going to just call myself a Holocaust revisionist. I am a historian, but I'm going to call myself a World War II revisionist, because there's so much that isn't common knowledge about what happened during World War II. It's a really fascinating time, but a hard time to be alive, particularly if you lived in Europe, the Soviet Union, Japan. So I wanted to touch base on a couple of books. One book, and I have not read this book yet. I've been researching it. It's a book called Germany Must Perish, and it was written by Theodor Kaufmann. And it was written right at the beginning of the war, and it talks about the plan to sterilize about 2/3 of the population in Germany, essentially exterminating the Germans. And this somewhat evolved into, I don't know if evolved is the right word, but this plan was not put into action. However, there's something called the Morgenthau Plan. And it was a plan to, after the war, when the Allied forces knew, and there was another book written about this in 1945, I believe, maybe 44, but I think 45. And the plan was to completely destroy German industry, particularly anything that had to do with military support. But it didn't take, for those that understood Germany's economy, Germany relied on imports to feed their people. It was said that domestically, Germany could produce enough to feed their people, 60% of their population. So what about the other 40%? So this is why it was vital, it was so important for Germany to be able to export, use industrial resources, to be able to afford to import food to feed the entire population. So this Morgenthau Plan would quite literally, starve the German people into extinction. Now, this plan was not, depending on who you talk to, it was not entirely put into effect. And you have to remember, and now Hitler and Goebbels and some of the high-ranking SS officers knew about this. They knew about this plan, and as a result, this was really why Germany not only didn't want to give up, didn't want to surrender, but they could not surrender. They knew that they were quite literally fighting for the preservation of their people, for the German people. And you have to remember that, Hitler was a veteran of World War One. These people were alive during that time. There was only about 20 years between World War One and World War Two, and it was really just an intermission. And we talked earlier about the Treaty of Versailles and the British blockade of Germany after World War One, and how the potentially up to 1 million people that starved to death in Germany after World War One, and the harsh conditions and what the German people had already experienced in regards to the barbarism of the First World War Allied forces. Again, the Treaty of Versailles, however you pronounce it, wherever you put the emphasis on, whatever syllable you put the emphasis on, was supposed to be a treaty. A treaty is supposed to be indicative of a truce, and that's not what happened. The war on Germany really never stopped, at least not until 1933 when Hitler came into power. And and it can't be said that just Hitler, but his economists, the National Socialist movement, brought dignity back to the German people. The unemployment rate was through the roof. The suicide rate was through the roof. These people had been demoralized, and he brought dignity back to Germany. And they knew, particularly when books are being written about this, that it was a real reality. That if Germany lost this war, it would mean the end of the German people. Now, the Morgenthau Plan was not entirely put into action, but there was a German Holocaust. Thousands and thousands, some say millions, of Germans and German soldiers that were taken prisoner after the war by the Soviets, worked labor camps in the Soviet Union. The absolute obliteration of cities like Dresden with firebombing, where they created firestorms. They bombed so massively that they created firestorms that literally sucked people into the fire as the fire burned so intensely, drawing oxygen into it, creating a warm and a wind and vortices, literally sucking people into the fire. This was genocide. This was genocide. And so, putting aside any of the atrocities that the Germans committed, and they did commit atrocities, the Allied forces, particularly the United States, were supposed to be liberators. They were supposed to hold the higher ground. And these are just a few examples. We haven't even talked about Japan yet and the 2 atomic bombs that were dropped, and we'll do an entire episode on that. So put aside what monsters the Nazis were for a moment. And just remember that there was an entire nation of people, and in fact Patton, who died on German soil, if I have that correctly. He died on a U.S. base on German soil. I think that's right. He died on a military base just after the war, and there's much speculation that it was not an accident. And that will be another episode. But Patton had said that we fought the wrong people, that we need to march on to Moscow now and defeat the Soviets while we still can. So, again, understanding that yes, the Nazis committed a lot of atrocities, and that it could be said that Hitler was evil. I think the real question is, was he more evil than Stalin? Was he more evil than Churchill? Was he more evil than Roosevelt? It is actually said that the Morgenthau Plan, when presented to the leaders of the Allied forces, Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin, that it was Churchill that actually said, we can't do this. It would be immoral and non-Christian like for us to do this, but then actually signed the plan to do it after threats of, basically money, basically bought out. They basically bought his signature. But then it was resisted by too many people. And one of the biggest resistance to it, evidently, were Allied forces, American soldiers, because when the Germans found out about the Morgenthau Plan, the resistance increased, and everybody wanted peace. The Western world, the free world, the Allied people of the Allied forces wanted peace. The American soldiers were tired of fighting. They were exhausted, and the Germans just dug their heels in and quite literally fought for their existence as German people. So, these are things that need to be understood. We've talked a little bit about, to understand where we truly stand today in the world, we have to first accurately understand what brought us to this point. And that's what we're trying to do. That this channel really, it's not my intention to entirely focus on the Holocaust, entirely focused on being a revisionist, but really the whole big picture. I want to get into the Bolshevik Revolution, the accusations that the Bolshevik communists, collectivists, were primarily Jewish in the creators and the people that commanded in that revolution. And if they were not, but it was believed by Germans, I want to touch on all of that. Why was it that the Germans were putting Jews in camps? Now, real quick, I will say that it has been said too that it was not just because they were Jewish, but that most Jews were Bolshevik communists, and communism was the enemy. There was a peace deal between Germany and the Soviet Union before the war broke out. And there was a peace deal because they feared war with each other. Now that deal obviously fell apart and they ended up at war, but that's because Germany was trying to resist communism. It wasn't that Germany wanted to go to war with England or wanted to go to war with France or specifically wanted to go to war with the United States. They didn't want communism. in their country. And it was a rising power. And communism between the year of 1922 and 1932, 33, had killed millions of people through intentional famines, intentional starvation, and the German people had a legitimate reason to be deathly afraid of communism. So there was a lot of things going on. The Germans didn't just pop up one day and say, we hate Jews. I'm not saying that what they did to the Jews was justified by any means. War is hell, you know, and it's important that we try to understand exactly what was going on, why things happen, whether we agree with them or not, and try to see things from all angles. So, thank you for joining me. Please like, subscribe, comment below. I know that there's something that somebody else can contribute to this. That is another one of the points of this channel. If you feel you can correct me on a point, or you have something to add to, and or want to bring up something that I have not talked about entirely, please do. I look forward to the comments, and until next time, thank you.